Okay, let's continue with the second part of this lecture, and we're going to be talking about the ribs next. Now, the ribs are long bones. So remember, the sternum was a flat bone. This one is a long bone. And as long bones, they have a head, an anterior end, and a shaft in between the two. Remember that the head is usually located posteriorly at the back, so the head is on the side of the vertebral column. They form the anterior, lateral, and posterior aspects of the thoracic cage. So the majority of the thoracic cage is actually formed by the ribs. They are 24 in number, or you can say that there are 12 pairs. But please make sure that when you're stating the number of ribs, that you're being specific. If you want to mention just how many they are, they're 24, but if you're going to use the term pairs, then make sure that you say 12 pairs. Now, the ribs can be classified in a number of ways. And yes, you do need to know both types of classification. First of all, they are classified based on the anatomical features of the rib itself. So you can have what we call a typical rib, and then obviously you're going to have what we call an atypical rib. Now, with the typical rib, there's a number of features that need to be found. First of all, this is the posterior end, okay, and this is what we call the head of the rib. Now you notice that the head of the rib is kind of flattened on both sides, up here and down there, okay, and this is called the articular facet. So the head has to have two articular facets. Now these are important because they articulate with the vertebra. So basically they allow the rib to be attached to the vertebra at the back. Okay, now extending from the head, and just keep in mind that any part of the body that has a head automatically has a neck as well. So extending after the head, so this is the head here, this is the region of the neck. Okay, now just after the neck or within the neck, you're going to find a bony process here. Okay, and this is called the tubercle. Okay, now the tubercle also articulates with the vertebra. Okay, and we're going to see how all of those join later on. Okay, once we're done with the posterior ends, so the head, the neck, and the tubercle, then you're going to notice that the shaft or the length of the rib kind of curves around. Okay, and when it starts to curve, we call that the angle of the rib. Okay. So then the shaft, sorry, my bad. Okay, the shaft is going to turn and it's going to continue until it reaches this flattened end here, and this is the anterior end of the rib. Now, if you notice, on the inferior aspect of the shaft of the rib here, we have, let's just call it like a small tunnel or a small elongated depression, and we call this the costal groove. Okay, so remember, you've got the head with two articular facets, the neck with the tubercle, the angle, the shaft with the costal groove, which is also sometimes called the subcostal groove, and then you've got the flattened anterior end. Now, typical ribs, as stated, are ribs that have a head with two facets. Please make sure that you mention that it has two facets. They have to be two. They have a neck and an angle, a tubercle, and a shaft that ends with a flat anterior surface, and a subcostal groove that is found on the lower border of the shaft. Now, in order for a rib to be classified as typical, it needs to have all 6 features. So if, for example, let's say it has a neck, an angle, and a tubercle, but the head only has one facet, we do not classify that as a typical rib. Okay? So any rib that does not have all of these features is considered an atypical rib. In terms of number, the typical ribs are from ribs 3 until 9. So from 3 all the way down to 9, those are typical. Atypical ribs are ribs 1 and 2. ribs 10, 11, and 12. Okay? The other classification of ribs is what we call true and false ribs. Now, this classification depends on the anterior attachment of the rib. Now, when we look at the orientation or how the thoracic cage is arranged, okay, you'll notice that some ribs attach to their costal cartilage, and then the costal cartilage directly attaches to the sternum, and this applies to, sorry, I keep doing that, this applies to the first 7 ribs, okay? What happens with rib number 8, which is down here, okay, is that the costal cartilage, instead of going directly into the sternum, it actually fuses with the costal cartilage that's above it. Okay, so it goes in there, and then that one continues upwards. And then the same thing applies to rib number 9. It attaches to the costal cartilage of rib number 8, and then that one goes up. And then 10 attaches to 9, and then we go back up. Okay, now the attachment or the fusion of one costal cartilage to the one above it forms a structure found at the lower border of the thoracic cage, and this is called the costal margin. And if we go all the way down here, if you notice ribs number 11 and 12, they don't actually have an anterior attachment. They're just kind of sitting there. They have their costal cartilages, but they're just kind of like, okay, floating. Okay, and you'll notice here they're called floating ribs. So, true ribs are ribs that attach to the sternum by a costal cartilage. So the rib attaches to the costal cartilage, and then that costal cartilage goes into the facet of the sternum. And this applies to ribs number 1 through to 7. False ribs either have an indirect attachment to the sternum, meaning that their costal cartilage inserts into the one above it. So like I showed you with ribs number 8, 9, and 10. Or they do not attach to the sternum at all, which were ribs number 11 and 12, and we describe them as floating ribs because they don't have an anterior attachment. Okay, that concludes the section related to the ribs. We'll continue with the rest of the thoracic cage in the next video.